A prejudiced and biased flight attendant confronts a black woman seated in first class. A high-stakes drama unfolds at 30,000 feet, culminating in an unexpected twist that serves poetic justice. Get ready for a tale that sheds light on the everyday, often invisible struggles faced by black individuals. Aaliyah Johnson stepped onto the plane, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she adjusted the strap of her sleek laptop bag. Flying first class wasn't a novelty for her. She'd earned this privilege through relentless effort and countless late nights. Yet, there was always a sense of accomplishment as she settled into the premium leather seat, a testament to her journey. Sliding her bag under the seat, she retrieved her phone to scan her packed schedule for the week. Among the tasks ahead was a multi-million-dollar civil rights case. But for now, this flight was a brief moment of respite. Closing her eyes, she leaned back, letting the gentle vibrations of the engines soothe her. The cabin buzzed with passengers' chatter, a distant hum, until a sharply polite voice pierced her tranquility. "Ma'am," said the flight attendant, her tone clipped yet courteous. She stood poised by Aaliyah's row, her uniform immaculate, blonde hair styled into a precise twist. "May I see your ticket, please?" Aaliyah opened her eyes, meeting the woman's gaze. There was an air of authority about her, though her request seemed less about procedure and more about suspicion. Without hesitation, Aaliyah handed over her ticket. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Natalie Parker, examined the boarding pass, her lips tightening briefly before returning it. "I just needed to check. Sometimes passengers get confused about their seats," Natalie remarked, her tone carrying a faint edge. "Not me," Aaliyah replied firmly, her voice steady. "I know where I belong." "Of course," Natalie said with a curt laugh, lingering a moment too long before moving down the aisle. As she turned away, Aaliyah caught a muttered comment under her breath. "Well, first class isn't what it used to be." Aaliyah stiffened, but chose to let it slide, her focus shifting to a work email demanding her attention. The exchange, however, left her uneasy. And as the flight progressed, her instincts told her that this was just the beginning. The subtle affronts began to accumulate. A stray glance from Natalie here, a deliberately delayed service there. The breaking point came when Natalie, in what seemed like a clumsy mistake, bumped Aaliyah's tray table while serving the passenger across the aisle, splashing water onto her lap. Though Aaliyah initially dismissed these as accidents, the steady stream of coincidences started to feel intentional. Soon, whispers began circulating between Natalie and another flight attendant. Phrases like, "Double-check if she's supposed to be here," and "can't take chances these days," reached Aaliyah's ears. Each word carried a weight, cutting through the pleasant facade of first-class accommodations. By the time the cabin doors closed, Aaliyah's brief moment of peace had been replaced by a growing vigilance. She could feel the storm brewing, not one caused by turbulence, but by prejudice. The plane had barely reached cruising altitude when Natalie returned, her demeanor feigning professionalism, but her intent unmistakable. Clipboard in hand, she addressed Aaliyah, her voice artificially polite. "Excuse me, ma'am," Natalie began, her expression calculated. "It appears there's been a mistake with the seating arrangement. I'm going to have to ask you to move to the main cabin." Aaliyah raised an eyebrow, her calm composure unshaken. "I don't believe there's any mistake," she replied, gesturing to the boarding pass tucked into her blazer pocket. "This is my assigned seat." Natalie's smile tightened, her tone hardening ever so slightly. "Sometimes these things happen. We just want to make sure everything is in order." Aaliyah's gaze never wavered. "Everything is in order," she said, her voice firm yet composed. "I paid for this seat, and I intend to stay here." The exchange caught the attention of nearby passengers. A man across the aisle lowered his tablet, his curiosity piqued, while others leaned in, whispering among themselves. Aaliyah noticed the growing audience, but refused to let it rattle her. Natalie's composure began to crack, her frustration evident in the faint pink that crept up her cheeks. She lowered her voice, leaning slightly closer to Aaliyah. "Look, let's not make this difficult. I'm giving you an opportunity to handle this discreetly." Aaliyah leaned back in her seat, her calm expression unbroken. "The only person making this difficult is you," she said, her tone as steady as ever. "If you're finished, I'd like to enjoy my flight. Natalie hesitated, her grip tightening on the clipboard. For a moment, it seemed she might press further, but the captain's voice over the intercom interrupted her, welcoming passengers and announcing the cruising altitude. Natalie retreated, her face a mask of barely concealed annoyance. Aaliyah watched her go, her instincts telling her that this was far from over. Minutes later, the beverage service began, handled by another flight attendant, as the tension in the cabin simmered, waiting for its inevitable eruption. Natalie's absence didn't last long. She soon returned, this time accompanied by a younger flight attendant who seemed visibly nervous. "She's refusing to move," Natalie said sharply, though her voice was low enough to avoid the captain overhearing. "I need you to back me up on this." The younger attendant hesitated, her eyes darting nervously between Aaliyah and the clipboard Natalie shoved into her hands. I'm not sure this is," she began, her voice trailing off. "Just do your job," Natalie snapped, her patience clearly thinning. Aaliyah folded her arms, her calm demeanor beginning to waver. She had tolerated enough. "Let me make this easy for you," she said, her voice steady but laced with controlled frustration. "If you're planning to escalate this, go ahead. My lawyer would be more than happy to discuss how your airline treats paying customers." Natalie's confidence faltered, her posture stiffening as the nearby passengers leaned in, openly observing the escalating exchange. The younger attendant, clearly uncomfortable, fumbled with the clipboard before casting Aaliyah a fleeting, apologetic glance and retreating down the aisle. Meanwhile, Michael Rivera, seated in the economy cabin, discreetly adjusted his camera lens. Angling it through the gap in the first-class curtain, he had been recording since Natalie's first confrontation with Aaliyah. His instincts told him this story wasn't anywhere close to being over. The murmurs among passengers grew louder as Natalie, now visibly flustered, leaned down toward Aaliyah again. This time, her voice carried a venomous edge. "You people always make everything about race," she hissed under her breath, her words dripping with malice. "I'm just doing my job." Aaliyah's gaze locked onto hers, unwavering. "And I'm just sitting in my seat," she replied, her tone calm but firm. "If you have a problem with that, take it up with someone who cares." Natalie straightened abruptly, her face blotchy with anger. She opened her mouth as if to retort but stopped herself, spinning on her heel and marching down the aisle with sharp, audible clicks of her heels. Aaliyah exhaled slowly, her pulse pounding in her ears. The weight of the other passengers' stares pressed on her, some sympathetic, others indifferent, and a few blatantly judgmental. She didn't care. Let them look. She wasn't moving. The cabin settled into an uneasy silence, but Aaliyah remained alert. Natalie's pacing near the galley was hard to miss, her tense whispers with another flight attendant drawing furtive glances in Aaliyah's direction. It was only a matter of time before the next confrontation. As expected, Natalie returned, this time dragging the younger attendant along again. The younger woman looked as though she wanted to vanish, her discomfort written all over her face. Natalie, on the other hand, attempted a facade of forced composure, though her simmering frustration was evident. "Ms. Johnson," Natalie began, her voice saccharine yet strained. "We've rechecked our records, and it seems there's still a discrepancy with your seat. I'm afraid you'll need to move to the back of the plane." Aaliyah set her book aside, turning her full attention to Natalie. "I've already told you there's no discrepancy," she said, her tone sharp and unyielding. "This is my seat, and I'm staying right here." Natalie's smile faltered, her irritation finally breaking through. "I understand you feel entitled to this seat," she said, her voice now dripping with condescension. "But I'm telling you, there's been a mistake." Aaliyah's patience snapped. "Let me be perfectly clear," she said, her words cutting through the tense air. "The only mistake here is how you're treating me. I am not moving." Natalie leaned in closer, lowering her voice as her professionalism slipped entirely. "You don't get to talk to me like that," she hissed. "I'm just doing my job. But of course, people like you always have to make a scene." The cabin seemed to freeze. Aaliyah's heart pounded, but her voice remained steady. "And what exactly do you mean by people like me?" Natalie's face flushed, and for a moment she was speechless. Then, With barely concealed anger, she spat back, "You know exactly what I mean." A ripple of murmurs swept through the cabin as nearby passengers exchanged glances. The tension was palpable. One passenger, an older man in a business suit, cleared his throat loudly, but Natalie ignored him. "You're being unreasonable," Natalie said, her voice rising slightly as though seeking support from the cabin. "It's not that complicated. We can resolve this quickly if you just cooperate." Aaliyah folded her arms. "Cooperate with what? Your blatant racism?" Natalie recoiled as though struck. "Excuse me? How dare you accuse me of that?" "I dare," Aaliyah said, her voice unwavering, "because that's exactly what this is. You haven't harassed anyone else in this cabin, just me. And everyone here knows it." Silence followed for a beat, before another voice broke through. "She's right," said a middle-aged woman seated 2 rows back. Her voice was firm. "I've been watching the whole time. You're singling her out." Natalie's head snapped toward the woman. "This has nothing to do with anyone else," she snapped. "I'm simply following protocol." "Sure you are," the woman replied, crossing her arms. "And I suppose protocol includes muttering insults under your breath. I heard you." A ripple of agreement swept through the cabin, and Natalie's composure faltered. She glanced toward the galley as though seeking reinforcements, but the younger flight attendant avoided her gaze, stepping back and retreating down the aisle. Meanwhile, Michael Rivera adjusted his camera again, zooming in on the heated exchange. Every moment was being documented, and he knew this story needed to be shared. Natalie's voice grew louder in desperation. "I don't have to explain myself to any of you. I'm in charge of this cabin, and I'll decide what's appropriate." Aaliyah remained seated, her voice steady and calm. "No, what you'll do is stop harassing me and start doing your job. Unless, of course, you'd prefer I escalate this further." Natalie blinked, clearly caught off guard by Aaliyah's composure. Her anger flared again, but she hesitated. Finally, with a frustrated huff, she spun on her heel and stormed off toward the cockpit. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder as passengers processed what they had just witnessed. The cabin buzzed with heightened energy as passengers debated the situation they had just witnessed. Some openly voiced support for Aaliyah, while others murmured about staying out of the confrontation. Aaliyah took a deep breath, her pulse still racing. She wasn't afraid of standing her ground, but the blatant nature of Natalie's actions had left her feeling exposed and deeply unsettled. She caught the eye of the middle-aged woman who had defended her earlier and offered a brief, grateful nod. Moments later, Natalie reappeared, this time accompanied by the captain. His expression was a mixture of weariness and annoyance, clearly displeased at being roped into the escalating conflict. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, his tone firm but tired. Natalie launched into a well-practiced narrative, painting Aaliyah as uncooperative and disruptive. Before she could finish her embellished account, Aaliyah interrupted. "Captain, I'm more than happy to explain," she said with measured calm. "I'm seated in the seat I purchased, and this flight attendant has been harassing me since I boarded. Her behavior is unacceptable, and there are witnesses who can attest to it." The captain frowned, his eyes narrowing slightly as he glanced between Aaliyah and Natalie. "Is that true?" he asked, addressing the surrounding passengers. Several nodded in unison, and one man spoke up. "I've seen everything. She's been targeting her for no reason at all." Natalie's face flushed a deep crimson, her mouth opening and closing as though searching for words. She seemed genuinely shocked that passengers were siding against her. "I see," the captain said after a pause, his tone noticeably cooler. "Miss Parker, may I have a word with you in the galley?" Natalie stiffened, her jaw tightening, but she had no choice but to comply. With visible reluctance, she followed him down the aisle. As the pair disappeared, Aaliyah leaned back in her seat, her body tense, her mind swirling with thoughts about what might come next. When the captain returned, his expression was carefully neutral, though his posture betrayed the tension he felt. He approached Aaliyah directly, and she sat upright, her composure intact, despite the frustration simmering inside her. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his voice measured, "to ensure the remainder of this flight proceeds smoothly, I'm going to ask for your cooperation. Miss Parker has raised concerns about your seating, and to avoid further disruption, I need you to move to a seat in the main cabin. Aaliyah's eyes narrowed, her disbelief apparent. Let me get this straight, she said, her voice sharp. You're asking me, the paying customer, to move because your flight attendant can't handle me sitting in first class? Is that what you're saying? The captain's jaw tightened, though his tone remained professional. I'm asking for your understanding to prevent further incident. Incident? Aaliyah repeated, incredulous. The only incident here is the blatant racism I've endured since I boarded this plane. I refuse to be punished for her actions. Before the captain could respond, Natalie appeared at his side, clipboard in hand, and a smug expression on her face. Captain, she interjected, her voice dripping with false sympathy, I've just confirmed with corporate that Ms. Johnson's seat was flagged as an irregular booking. There was a system glitch, and it appears her seat wasn't officially cleared. Aaliyah froze, a wave of anger rushing through her. You've got to be kidding me, she said, her voice low but firm. These things happen, Natalie said with mock regret, holding up the clipboard as if it were irrefutable evidence. We'll be happy to accommodate you in the main cabin, and of course, provide a voucher for the inconvenience. The cabin erupted in murmurs as passengers speculated about what was happening. Aaliyah's fingers gripped the armrest tightly, the weight of countless eyes pressing on her. She could feel their stares, some supportive, others judgmental, all waiting to see how she would respond. You cannot be serious, Aaliyah said, her tone deadly calm. This is nothing more than a poorly disguised attempt to humiliate me. Natalie leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. If you don't move now, I'll make sure security is waiting for you when we land. It's your choice. For a brief moment, Aaliyah's resolve wavered. She wasn't afraid of a fight, but she knew how quickly narratives could be twisted, especially against someone like her. The image of sensational headlines flashed through her mind. Black woman removed from first class in heated dispute. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before standing. The cabin fell silent, and Natalie's smirk widened in satisfaction. I'll move, Aaliyah said, her voice firm despite the fury simmering beneath the surface. But not because you're right, only because this isn't over. And when I'm done, you'll regret not handling this differently. Natalie blinked, her confidence faltering for the first time. Aaliyah grabbed her laptop bag and stepped into the aisle, her head held high as she walked toward the main cabin. Whispers followed her, but she refused to acknowledge them. As she passed through the curtain into economy, Michael Rivera stood from his seat. His camera, discreetly tucked in his hand, captured the moment, but his voice rang clear and unwavering. This isn't right, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. We all saw what happened. Don't think for a second this won't go public. Aaliyah met his gaze and gave him a small nod of gratitude. Michael returned to his seat, focusing once more on the footage he had been capturing throughout the ordeal. Once seated in the main cabin, Aaliyah opened her laptop, her fingers flying over the keys as she documented every detail of the incident while it was fresh in her mind. She wouldn't let Natalie or the airline silence her. Natalie might have won this round, but Aaliyah was determined to fight back. Back in first class, the mood was tense. Some passengers exchanged uneasy glances, while others whispered their outrage. Michael continued recording, knowing that the truth of what had happened would soon come to light. As the plane soared westward, the murmurs among passengers grew louder, discontent spreading like wildfire. Natalie strutted down the aisle, her expression smug, but the cracks in her composure were beginning to show. More passengers were speaking up, their voices rising in subtle but undeniable defiance. By the time Natalie returned to the galley, she found herself cornered by a middle-aged woman who had clearly had enough. You should be ashamed of yourself, the woman hissed, her voice cutting through the low hum of the engines, loud enough for those nearby to hear. This isn't going to end well for you. For a brief moment, Natalie's confidence wavered. Her professional mask slipped, revealing a flicker of uncertainty before she quickly brushed off the woman with a forced smile. Yet, the unease in her expression lingered, a seed of doubt firmly planted. Meanwhile, in the cramped confines of the main cabin, Aaliyah sat stiffly in her assigned seat. Her laptop rested on the tray table, the screen glowing as her fingers moved furiously across the keyboard. The steady hum of the plane contrasted sharply with the tempest brewing inside her. She documented every detail she could recall: the venom in Natalie's comments, the captain's weak attempt to placate her, and the humiliation of being forced to vacate a seat she had rightfully paid for. Passengers around her stole glances, their whispers barely muffled. Some looked on with sympathy, while others appeared curious or quietly disapproving. A few wore expressions of discomfort, as though her mere presence unsettled them. Aaliyah ignored it all, her focus laser-sharp on the account she was constructing, each keystroke a step toward reclaiming her dignity. Back in first class, the air had grown thick with tension. Michael Rivera, seated discreetly with his camera, continued to document the aftermath of Aaliyah's removal. Occasionally, his lens caught Natalie pacing the aisle, her smug demeanor noticeably diminished. Her air of superiority had ebbed, replaced by a nervous energy as she caught the accusatory glances passengers were casting her way. Michael scrolled through his footage, a satisfied glint in his eye. He had captured nearly everything: Natalie's snide remarks, her triumphant smirk, and most damning of all, the moment she leaned in to deliver her thinly veiled threat about security. But he knew this wasn't over. The final act had yet to play out. The tipping point came when the middle-aged woman who had defended Aaliyah earlier pressed the call button. Natalie approached, her smile tight and brittle. "Yes, ma'am? How can I assist you?" she asked, her tone saccharine sweet. The woman didn't mince words. "You can start by explaining why you thought it was appropriate to humiliate that woman," she said bluntly, her voice carrying across the cabin. Natalie's smile faltered. "I'm not sure what you mean," she stammered. "Oh, I think you know exactly what I mean," the woman replied, her voice sharp. "We all saw it. You targeted her from the moment she boarded. It's disgusting. And frankly, I'm appalled that this airline allows behavior like yours." A murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin, and Natalie's cheeks flushed crimson. Her professional mask began to crack. "I was following protocol," she said tightly. "It's my job to ensure seating arrangements are correct. And does protocol include muttering under your breath about her, or threatening to call security for sitting in her assigned seat?" the woman pressed, her tone razor-sharp. "That's not what happened," Natalie snapped, her voice rising. "You're twisting things." Another passenger, a younger man seated across the aisle, chimed in. "Actually, I heard you too, and I saw the whole thing. You were completely out of line." Natalie whipped her head toward him, her eyes blazing. "I don't need to explain myself to you," she hissed. "Maybe not," the middle-aged woman interjected coolly, "but you'll have plenty of explaining to do when this goes public." Natalie froze, her face blanching. "Public?" she echoed, her voice trembling. The woman gestured toward Michael, who had stopped pretending to be subtle. His phone was now in plain sight, aimed squarely at Natalie. "Oh, yes," the woman said, her tone dripping with satisfaction. "Smile for the camera, dear." Natalie's confidence crumbled. Her face drained of color as the realization sank in. Her behavior had been captured, and the evidence was irrefutable. Without another word, she spun on her heel and stormed toward the galley, muttering under her breath. In the main cabin, Aaliyah's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen to find a text notification from an unfamiliar number. Opening it, she read the message. "I've got everything on video. This isn't over. Stay strong." It was from Michael. A small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. For the first time since boarding the plane, she felt a glimmer of hope. She quickly typed back, "Thank you. I'm documenting everything on my end, too." The remainder of the flight passed in a tense stalemate. Natalie stayed in the galley, avoiding eye contact with the passengers. Aaliyah kept typing, her fingers moving rhythmically as she chronicled every moment of the ordeal. Occasionally, Michael glanced back toward her seat, exchanging brief nods of solidarity. As the captain announced their descent into Los Angeles, the tension in the cabin reached its peak. Natalie re-emerged, her face a neutral mask as she prepared the cabin for landing. She avoided Aaliyah's gaze, but couldn't hide the flicker of apprehension in her eyes. When the plane touched down and began taxiing toward the gate, Aaliyah's resolve solidified. She closed her laptop and slid it into her bag, her mind steeling itself for the battle to come. Back in first class, Michael powered off his camera, leaning back in his seat with a satisfied smile. He had captured the truth, and he knew its impact would be undeniable. Natalie, however, looked anything but composed. Her movements were hurried and jerky as she gathered her belongings, her forced smile long gone. The walls were closing in, and she knew it. As the seatbelt sign dinged off and passengers began to rise, Michael prepared for the next chapter of this story to unfold, one that Natalie would not be able to escape. As the aisle emptied and the plane door opened, Aaliyah remained seated, unwilling to join the hurried exodus of passengers. Her thoughts were razor-sharp, replaying every moment of the flight with vivid clarity. Each comment, every humiliation, and the simmering indignity Natalie had forced upon her was seared into her memory. She couldn't let this go, not after everything that had unfolded. From first class, Michael Rivera adjusted his bag, glancing through the curtain toward Aaliyah one last time. His voice was low but resolute as he muttered, "This is just the beginning." He tucked his camera securely into his bag and rose from his seat, his expression steadfast as he prepared to disembark. Aaliyah finally stood, slinging her bag over her shoulder as she moved toward the exit. The younger flight attendant, who had stayed silent earlier, approached her with hesitant steps, glancing nervously over her shoulder, as if to check if Natalie was nearby. The woman began, her voice soft and uncertain. "I wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened. It wasn't fair." Aaliyah regarded her with a measured gaze, her voice steady, but tinged with restrained frustration. "Then why didn't you say anything when it mattered?" The attendant's shoulders sagged as guilt clouded her expression. "I was scared," she admitted. "Natalie can be difficult to stand up to." "Your fear doesn't excuse your silence," Aaliyah replied firmly. "By saying nothing, you were complicit in her actions." The attendant nodded, her face flushing with shame. "You're right," she whispered. "I should have spoken up." Without another word, Aaliyah stepped past her, her head held high as she made her way toward the jet bridge. As she approached the exit, Natalie stood there, her professional facade firmly in place. The smug arrogance that had defined her earlier demeanor was gone, replaced by a brittle calm. "Have a good day," Natalie said flatly, her eyes flickering away from Aaliyah's. Aaliyah stopped and turned to face her, lowering her voice so only Natalie could hear. "You might want to remember this day," she said, "because it's going to haunt you." Natalie flinched, her composure faltering for the briefest moment, but she said nothing. Aaliyah walked past her, stepping into the jet bridge with an unwavering sense of purpose. In the terminal, Aaliyah was greeted by an unexpected scene. A small group of passengers had lingered near the gate, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. Michael stood nearby, speaking animatedly to a woman holding a notepad. His camera, now slung around his neck, remained a silent but powerful reminder of the events that had transpired. When Michael spotted Aaliyah, he raised his voice slightly, drawing the attention of the onlookers. "Ms. Johnson," he called, his tone encouraging, "would you like to say anything about what happened?" The murmurs among the group grew louder as heads turned toward her. For a moment, Aaliyah hesitated, the weight of their gazes pressing down on her. But then she remembered Natalie's smugness, the whispered slights, and the blatant disrespect. This wasn't just her story anymore. It was about standing up against injustice. Straightening her posture, she addressed the group with a steady voice. "What happened on that flight was unacceptable," she said, her tone clear and firm. "I was targeted and humiliated because of someone else's prejudice. I deserve better, and so does every passenger who flies with this airline. This isn't just about me. It's about accountability." Michael's camera captured every word, while the woman with the notepad scribbled furiously. A few passengers began clapping softly, their quiet nods of agreement bolstering her resolve. Before Aaliyah could continue, Natalie emerged from the jet bridge, her face pale and her steps hurried. Her gaze swept over the group before narrowing on Michael's camera. "Natalie Parker," Michael said, stepping forward with determination, "do you have anything to say about your treatment of Mrs. Johnson during the flight?" For a split second, Natalie's composure cracked. Her lips tightened as she shot him a glare. "No comment!" she snapped. Her voice clipped. She quickened her pace, attempting to evade the growing crowd. Michael's camera followed her retreat, passengers calling out questions with tones that ranged from frustrated to accusatory. Aaliyah watched Natalie's hasty exit, a spark of satisfaction kindling within her. The confidence Natalie had flaunted earlier was dissolving, replaced by the stark reality of her actions. As the crowd began to disperse, Aaliyah's phone buzzed. A notification lit up her screen, displaying a trending hashtag and flying while black. She tapped on it and found that Michael's video had already gained traction, with hundreds of comments flooding in. Outrage poured through the posts, demanding justice and accountability. Her resolve hardened. This was no longer an isolated incident. It was becoming a movement. Natalie wouldn't escape accountability, and neither would the airline. Justice wasn't just a possibility. It was inevitable. Michael glanced up from his footage and caught Aaliyah's eye. Their gazes met, and she gave him a small, appreciative nod. He returned it, his expression mirroring her determination. As Aaliyah turned toward the terminal exit, the cool Los Angeles air greeted her, sharp and bracing. Her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications as the video continued to spread. Each message and comment fueled her determination to see this through. Behind her, Michael called out, jogging to catch up. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his camera still in hand, but this time his voice held a note of something deeper, a shared purpose that underscored everything they had endured. Michael adjusted the strap of his bag, slung across his chest, and approached Aaliyah with purposeful strides, his brow furrowed, his expression a mix of determination and shared indignation. "I'm glad I caught you," he said, slightly out of breath. "Look, I'm sorry for what you went through back there. It was disgusting. I've uploaded everything I captured. It's already going viral." Aaliyah regarded him carefully, her initial gratitude tempered by skepticism. "Why are you doing this?" she asked bluntly. "What's in it for you?" Michael hesitated, then shrugged. "I'm a journalist, sure, but I'm also just a person who's tired of seeing things like this happen. If I can help expose the truth, maybe it'll make a difference." His sincerity was evident, and after a moment, Aaliyah nodded. "Thank you," she said simply. "I appreciate it." As they walked toward the baggage claim, Michael pulled out his phone, scrolling through the growing number of shares and comments on his video. "It's not just the footage that's blowing up," he said. "People are digging up complaints about Natalie Parker. This isn't the first time she's been accused of misconduct." Aaliyah stopped mid-step. "What?" Michael nodded grimly, lowering his voice. "There are multiple incidents of her targeting passengers, though nothing quite this blatant. Most of them didn't go public, just quiet complaints that were swept under the rug." Aaliyah's jaw tightened, her anger simmering. "Of course they were," she muttered. "That's how it always goes." Michael glanced at her, his expression resolute. "Not this time. You've got people backing you now. The airline's already scrambling. They're going to have to respond." Before Aaliyah could reply, her phone buzzed. The screen displayed an incoming call from the airline's customer service line. She hesitated briefly before answering. "This is Aaliyah Johnson." "Ms. Johnson?" came the clipped but professional voice on the other end. "This is Rachel Bennett from the airline's legal department. We're aware of the incident on your flight today and would like to discuss how we can resolve the matter." Aaliyah's lips pressed into a thin line. "Resolve the matter? I don't think an apology and a voucher are going to cut it." There was a pause before Rachel responded cautiously. "We're prepared to discuss compensation, but we'd like to avoid any unnecessary publicity." Aaliyah's anger flared. "Publicity? You're worried about your image while I was humiliated and forced out of my seat? Your flight attendant acted with blatant racism, and your staff backed her up. Do you really think throwing money at this will make it go away?" "Ms. Johnson, I assure you we take these matters seriously," Rachel said, her tone growing defensive. "I'll bet you do, now that it's trending," Aaliyah snapped. "If you were serious, you would have addressed the other complaints against her before this ever happened." Another pause. "We need time to investigate those allegations," Rachel said carefully. "In the meantime, we'd appreciate it if you could refrain from making further public statements." A sharp laugh escaped Aaliyah. "Let me save you the trouble." "No, I'm not staying silent, and I'm not letting this go. Before Rachel could respond, Aaliyah ended the call, her fingers trembling slightly as she gripped her phone. Michael watched her closely, concern and admiration mingling in his expression. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," she replied, though her tone was clipped. "They're scared, which means we're getting somewhere." As they approached the baggage claim area, Aaliyah noticed a cluster of reporters gathered near the exit. Their cameras swiveled toward her, microphones raised like weapons. Michael followed her gaze. "You don't have to talk to them if you're not ready," he said gently. Aaliyah squared her shoulders. Determination etched across her face. "No, I do. This isn't just about me anymore." She stepped forward, the reporters closing in like a wave. Questions came at her from all directions, their voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus. "Ms. Johnson, can you comment on the video going viral? Do you believe the airline condones discrimination? What are your next steps?" Aaliyah raised a hand, silencing the crowd with a commanding gesture. "What happened to me today was wrong," she began, her voice steady and firm. "It wasn't just about a seat. It was about being treated as less than, about someone using their authority to demean and dehumanize me. I won't let that stand. I intend to hold the airline accountable and ensure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Her voice resonated with power, silencing the crowd as they hung on her every word. From the edge of the group, Michael captured every moment on his camera, his expression unreadable but focused. As the reporters pressed for more details, Aaliyah kept her responses measured, refusing to let emotion cloud her message. By the time she stepped away, the murmurs of support and outrage were undeniable. Michael caught up to her as she walked toward the exit. "That was powerful," he said. "You're making waves." Aaliyah glanced at him, her resolve unwavering. "Good, because this isn't over, not by a long shot." She climbed into the waiting car, her mind racing with plans for the next steps. Natalie Parker and the airline wouldn't know what hit them. As the car pulled away, Aaliyah's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. Michael's video was taking on a life of its own, spreading across social media with hashtags like "Flying While Black" and "Airline Racism." Each post brought new stories of discrimination, fueling the fire. This was no longer just about her. It was about dismantling a system of prejudice. Her thoughts were interrupted by another call. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number. Taking a deep breath, she answered. "This is Aaliyah Johnson." "Ms. Johnson," said a crisp voice on the other end. "This is Sharon Goodman, a reporter with the Daily Sentinel." Aaliyah's phone buzzed insistently, snapping her attention away from the whirlwind of notifications flooding her screen. She answered to hear the brisk voice of Sharon Goodman, a reporter from the Daily Sentinel. "I'm covering the growing backlash against the airline after today's incident. Do you have a moment to comment?" Sharon asked, her tone professional but eager. Aaliyah hesitated briefly. She wasn't certain how much she wanted to share yet, but she knew the importance of controlling her narrative. "I can give you a brief statement," she said finally. "Excellent," Sharon replied quickly. "Can you confirm that you were removed from your first-class seat by a flight attendant despite having paid for it?" "That's correct," Aaliyah affirmed, her voice calm yet firm. "I was targeted and humiliated because of the color of my skin. The flight attendant used her authority to demean me and then attempted to cover it up by fabricating a seating discrepancy." Sharon's tone shifted slightly, taking on an edge of determination. "And what do you plan to do next?" "I'm pursuing legal action," Aaliyah said without hesitation. "This isn't just about me. It's about ensuring this kind of behavior doesn't continue. People need to be held accountable." Sharon thanked her for the statement and ended the call, leaving Aaliyah with a mix of satisfaction and anticipation. Her words would undoubtedly add fuel to the growing fire, but that was exactly what she intended. The moment she set her phone down, it buzzed again. This time, the caller ID displayed Charles Porter, her attorney. His voice was calm but serious. "Aaliyah, I've been monitoring the situation," he began. "We need to move quickly. The airline is already facing significant backlash, and we can leverage that to push for a settlement or file a full-scale lawsuit." "I want to sue," Aaliyah said decisively. "No settlements. They need to face real consequences." "Understood," Charles replied, "but be prepared. They'll try to discredit you, dig into your past, anything to deflect blame. "Let them," Aaliyah said coldly. "I have nothing to hide." Meanwhile, chaos erupted at the airline's corporate offices. Rachel Bennett, the legal advisor who had earlier called Aaliyah, stood in a tense meeting with the PR and executive teams. The video footage, combined with Aaliyah's public statements, had thrown the company into full-blown damage control. "This is a disaster!" an executive fumed, slamming his hand on the conference table. "That video has over 1 million views, and every major news outlet is picking it up. What the hell was Natalie thinking?" "We need to act fast," Rachel interjected. "We've already reached out to Ms. Johnson to discuss a resolution, but she's not interested in settling quietly." The room fell silent as her words sank in. Finally, another executive spoke, their tone cold. "We need a scapegoat, someone to take the fall." Rachel's lips thinned. "That's already happening. Natalie Parker has a history of complaints, and this incident will end her career. But if we don't handle this carefully, the backlash won't stop with her." "What are you suggesting?" someone asked. "We issue a public apology and announce an internal review of our policies," Rachel said. "But we also need to prepare for a lawsuit. Ms. Johnson isn't going to let this go." At her apartment, Aaliyah was finalizing her timeline of events when a notification lit up her screen. A statement from the airline had just been posted to their social media accounts. She clicked on it, her eyes narrowing as she read, "We are aware of the incident involving Ms. Aaliyah Johnson on Flight 347 and are conducting a full investigation. We take these matters seriously and are committed to ensuring that all passengers are treated with dignity and respect. We sincerely apologize for any distress caused and are working to address the situation." Aaliyah scoffed. The carefully worded statement was designed to minimize liability while feigning concern. She wasn't impressed. Her phone buzzed again with a message from Michael. "Corporate damage control. Don't let up." A grim smile tugged at her lips. Michael was right. The airline's apology wasn't nearly enough. Real change required sustained pressure. Opening her laptop, she began drafting her own statement. If the airline thought they could control the narrative, they were about to learn how wrong they were. The next morning, Aaliyah awoke to a flood of notifications. Michael's video had gone viral overnight, turning the incident into a trending topic worldwide. News outlets dissected the footage. Natalie Parker's name became a byword for bigotry, and hashtags like "Flying While Black" and "Airline Racism" dominated social media. As Aaliyah scrolled through the latest developments over coffee, she saw articles speculating about Natalie's past, opinion pieces condemning the airline, and countless posts demanding systemic change. Her inbox was flooded with interview requests and messages of support. Her phone rang again. It was Charles. "Morning, Charles," she greeted, setting down her coffee. "Morning, Aaliyah," he said, his tone sharp and businesslike. "I've reviewed the video and your documentation. We're in an excellent position. The airline's apology won't hold up against the backlash, and they'll have no choice but to respond to a lawsuit." "They're already trying to save face," Aaliyah replied, "but I'm not interested in their performative apologies." "Good," Charles said approvingly. "I've prepared a formal demand letter. I'll need your approval before sending it. I'm also lining up interviews with legal analysts to bolster our case." "Send it," Aaliyah said firmly. "It's time they're held accountable." As Charles outlined the next steps, Aaliyah felt a renewed sense of purpose. This fight wasn't just hers anymore. It had become a collective stand against systemic injustice. The screen flickered to life, revealing another former airline employee. This time, it was a man in his early 40s, wearing a pressed shirt and tie, speaking from what appeared to be a home office. His tone was steady, but his expression carried the weight of frustration and suppressed anger. "My name is Marcus Hayes," he began. "I worked for the airline as a gate agent for nearly a decade, and I had the unfortunate experience of dealing with Natalie Parker on multiple occasions. Her behavior toward passengers, particularly passengers of color, was a problem we all knew about but were powerless to address. Complaints were ignored. swept under the rug, or dismissed as misunderstandings. The airline's culture enabled this, and now they're finally being forced to reckon with it. Aaliyah and Charles exchanged a knowing glance. The pieces were falling into place. The video continued as Marcus recounted specific incidents. He detailed how Natalie had frequently gone out of her way to challenge and intimidate passengers she deemed unworthy of first class, and how her actions had led to numerous written complaints, none of which were acted upon by the airline. "She was protected," Marcus said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Management always sided with her, no matter what. I tried to push back, but in the end, the system was designed to protect employees like her, not the passengers." Charles paused the video, setting the tablet down with deliberate care. "This is huge," he said, his tone serious. "If more employees come forward, we're not just looking at a case of individual misconduct. This could expose systemic discrimination." Aaliyah nodded, her resolve solidifying further. "That's exactly what needs to happen. It's not just about Natalie. It's about the entire culture they've allowed to thrive." Across the city, Natalie Parker sat in her dimly lit apartment, staring at the notifications lighting up her phone. Each one felt like another blow, another reminder that her life was unraveling. She clutched a cold cup of coffee, her hands trembling as the news played on her laptop, each segment dissecting her actions and dragging her name further into infamy. The phone buzzed, and Natalie hesitated before picking it up. It was Rachel Bennett again. "Damage control," Natalie muttered bitterly before answering. "Hello?" Rachel's tone was curt and icy. "We need to talk. The situation has escalated." Natalie bristled. "Escalated? What about my side of the story? No one's even asking how I feel." "There is no side of the story that justifies what you did," Rachel snapped. "The video speaks for itself, and now former employees are coming forward. You've put the airline in an impossible position." "I was following protocol," Natalie protested, her voice rising. "She didn't belong in first class, and I was just doing my job." "Enough," Rachel cut her off sharply. "Your actions have cost us millions in PR damage, and we're facing a lawsuit that could turn into a class action. You're lucky we haven't terminated you outright." Natalie's breath caught, the reality of her situation sinking in. "What do you want me to do?" she asked quietly, her defiance replaced by desperation. "You're being placed on unpaid leave, effective immediately," Rachel said coldly. "Do not speak to the media or make any public statements. The airline will be issuing another apology and conducting a formal investigation into your behavior." "But," Natalie began. "This isn't up for discussion," Rachel snapped, cutting her off. "If you try to fight this, you'll only make things worse." The line went dead. Natalie stared at her phone, her world crumbling around her. Back in Charles's office, Aaliyah leaned back in her chair, absorbing the weight of the revelations. More videos were surfacing, each adding to the growing scandal. Employees, passengers, and even former managers were stepping forward, recounting stories of a toxic culture and ignored complaints. Charles clasped his hands together, his tone grave but optimistic. "This is bigger than any of us anticipated. If we position this correctly, we can push for systemic changes within the airline industry. Are you ready for that level of scrutiny?" "I'm more than ready," Aaliyah said, her voice unwavering. "They've ignored this for too long. It's time to make them face the consequences." Charles smiled faintly, then gestured toward the tablet. "We'll use everything we've gathered. The demand letter is out, and now we wait for their response. But in the meantime, let's make sure we stay ahead of the narrative. The more evidence we bring to light, the stronger our position." As Charles's assistant stepped back into the room with more updates, Aaliyah felt a renewed sense of purpose. The airline had underestimated her resolve, but she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, overlooked, and mistreated. Justice was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. The screen froze on the image of the former airline employee, his serious expression highlighting the gravity of his words. "I personally witnessed Natalie Parker harass passengers on multiple occasions," he had said, his voice steady yet grim. "She targeted people of color under the guise of enforcing policy. I reported her several times, but nothing ever changed. Management always brushed it under the rug. Charles paused the video, setting the tablet down on his desk with a decisive motion. His eyes met Aaliyah's, his expression resolute. "This is exactly what we need," he said. "It's no longer just about what happened to you. It's about a pattern of discrimination." Aaliyah exhaled slowly, anger tightening in her chest. "They knew," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They knew what she was doing, and they let it continue." Meanwhile, in the stark conference room of the airline's headquarters, Rachel Bennett was fielding a barrage of heated questions from senior executives. The air was thick with frustration and panic, the tension palpable. "This is getting out of hand," one executive barked, slamming his fist on the table. "We've got ex-employees coming out of the woodwork accusing us of systemic racism. We need a plan." Rachel, composed despite the chaos, responded calmly. "The first step is taking Natalie Parker off the payroll entirely. She's already on unpaid leave, but we need to terminate her contract immediately and make that announcement public." "And then what?" another executive demanded. "Throw her under the bus and hope that's enough? What about Miss Johnson? She's not backing down." Rachel's gaze hardened. "We need to make a direct offer to her. Something generous enough that she might consider settling. But we also need to prepare for the likelihood that she won't. If this goes to court, we're looking at a PR nightmare." "We're already in a PR nightmare," another executive snapped. "What about these former employees? Can we discredit them?" Rachel's jaw tightened. "That's risky. Any attempt to discredit them could backfire spectacularly. We need to show that we're taking their claims seriously, even if it means conducting an internal audit." An executive leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "So we sacrifice Natalie, pretend to clean house, and hope it blows over?" Rachel didn't respond immediately, her silence speaking volumes. She knew the truth. This wasn't going to blow over. Not with Aaliyah driving the narrative and the public demanding real change. As the airline scrambled to contain the fallout, Aaliyah returned home to find Michael waiting outside her building. His phone was in hand, his expression a mix of determination and urgency. "Something big just happened," he said as she approached. "Natalie Parker's been fired." Aaliyah's eyes narrowed. "Let me guess. They're hoping that's enough to make this go away." Michael nodded. "Exactly. But it's not working. People are calling for a full investigation into the airline's policies. And get this, another former employee is about to go public with her story. She's willing to testify if this goes to court." Aaliyah unlocked the door and motioned for him to follow her inside. "Good," she said. "The more voices, the stronger our case." Once inside, Michael pulled out his phone and opened a social media app. "You're trending again," he said, handing her the device. The top post was a clip of Aaliyah's earlier statement to reporters, paired with the headline, "Aaliyah Johnson takes on airline discrimination." Aaliyah set the phone down, her expression thoughtful. "They think firing Natalie is enough. But they're wrong. This isn't just about her. It's about the system that allowed her behavior to continue." Michael leaned forward, admiration sparking in his eyes. "So, what's next?" "We keep pushing," Aaliyah said firmly. "They're scrambling now, but we need to make sure this goes beyond one employee. Policies need to change, and they need to admit their complicity." Michael nodded. "You're not just fighting for yourself anymore. You're making history." Aaliyah gave him a small smile. "That's the plan." So, the following morning, Aaliyah woke to another wave of headlines. This time, the focus was on the airline's newly announced internal investigation into claims of systemic racism. Their official statement promised policy reviews, staff retraining, and accountability, but the tone felt hollow, designed to pacify rather than enact real change. Charles had warned her this would happen. Corporate lip service aimed at making the issue disappear. As Aaliyah scrolled through online responses, she noticed the skepticism. Many accused the airline of saving face without addressing the root cause, while others demanded justice for Aaliyah and the employees who had come forward. The pressure was mounting, and the airline's attempts to shift the narrative weren't working. Her phone buzzed. Charles's name flashed on the screen. "Good timing," she said, as she picked up. "I was just reading their statement. It's nothing more than damage control," Charles replied. "They're hoping this investigation buys them time, but we're not letting up. The lawsuit is already making waves, And now we have another key piece of leverage. What's that? Aaliyah asked. Her curiosity piqued. Several passengers from your flight have agreed to testify, Charles said. They witnessed everything and are willing to back up your account in court. Aaliyah exhaled in relief. That's huge. If we can show this wasn't an isolated incident, their case will crumble. Exactly, Charles said. And with the former employees' testimonies, we're building a narrative of negligence and systemic issues. This isn't just about Natalie anymore. It's about the airline's failure to act. Good, Aaliyah said firmly. They've had this coming for a long time. At the airline's headquarters, Rachel Bennett sat in yet another tense meeting. The fallout from Natalie's firing had only deepened the crisis. As executives debated their next move, Rachel's phone buzzed with a notification. Another former employee had gone public with allegations, and this time the story was gaining traction fast. Rachel glanced at the headline and knew the truth. They were losing control of the narrative, and Aaliyah Johnson wasn't going to stop until the airline faced the reckoning it had long avoided. The executive team at the airline headquarters sat in a tense silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on them like a storm cloud. Rachel Bennett's voice cut through the heavy air, calm yet firm. The lawsuit is gaining traction, she began, placing a stack of documents on the table. We need to prepare for the real possibility of this going to trial. One of the executives shook his head in frustration. We can't let it get that far. The optics would be catastrophic. Then we need to act decisively, Rachel replied. Announcing Natalie's termination was a necessary first step, but it's not enough. The public is demanding systemic change. Another executive sighed, running a hand through his hair. So what do you suggest? Overhaul our entire training program? Fire half the staff? Rachel's gaze was unwavering. We start by settling with Ms. Johnson. A public trial will destroy us. She has video evidence, witnesses, and overwhelming public support. We can't win in court. The room fell into a heavy silence as her words hung in the air. Finally, the CEO leaned forward, his expression grim. Fine. Make her an offer, but it needs to include a confidentiality agreement. If this goes public, it's over. Later that afternoon, Aaliyah's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She recognized the number immediately. It was Rachel Bennett. Ms. Johnson, Rachel began, her tone professional but noticeably restrained. This is Rachel Bennett, representing the airline. I know who you are, Aaliyah replied, her voice steady. I'd like to discuss a potential resolution to this matter. Rachel continued, we're prepared to offer a substantial settlement along with a formal apology for your experience. Aaliyah's grip on the phone tightened. And what does that settlement come with? A non-disclosure agreement? Rachel hesitated. A split-second pause, but enough to confirm Aaliyah's suspicion. Yes, we'd expect confidentiality as part of the agreement. This would allow us to focus on implementing meaningful changes without further distractions. Aaliyah let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Meaningful changes? You mean sweeping this under the rug? Ms. Johnson, Rachel said, her voice strained. We take these allegations seriously. This settlement is an acknowledgement of our commitment to making things right. I'm not interested in hush money, Aaliyah said sharply. I want accountability. Public accountability. You've allowed people like Natalie Parker to operate unchecked for years. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's been targeted because of your negligence. Please reconsider, Rachel pressed. A trial would be long and difficult for everyone involved. Settling would allow us to resolve this quickly and focus on moving forward. I'm not afraid of a trial, Aaliyah said coldly, but maybe your executives should be. Without waiting for a response, she ended the call. Her heart pounded, but her resolve was stronger than ever. This wasn't about money. It was about justice. The airline's efforts to control the narrative unraveled further with every passing hour. News outlets aired interviews with former employees and passengers, each one painting a more damning picture of the airline's culture. Social media was ablaze with calls for boycotts and demands for systemic reform. That evening, Michael Rivera called, his voice buzzing with excitement. Aaliyah, I just got word that a major civil rights organization wants to back your case. They're offering legal and financial support. That's incredible, Aaliyah said, a genuine smile breaking through her exhaustion. With their help, we can make this even bigger. Michael chuckled. Bigger is an understatement. You're becoming the face of a movement. I didn't ask for that, Aaliyah said softly, but if it's what it takes to make things change, I'll do it. As the call ended, Aaliyah allowed herself a moment to reflect. The fight was far from over, but the tide was turning. The airline was on the defensive, and for the first time, real accountability felt within reach. In the days leading up to the trial, Aaliyah's life became a whirlwind of preparation, media coverage, and mounting tension. She worked tirelessly with Charles, reviewing every detail of her case. The growing mountain of evidence, combined with witness testimonies, painted a damning picture of the airline's negligence. In Charles's office, the atmosphere was electric as they finalized their strategy. Aaliyah sat across from him, her laptop open, as she read the latest witness statements. Beside her, Charles paced the room, a file in hand. The key to this case, Charles began, is not just proving what happened to you, but demonstrating the airline's systemic negligence. The video is powerful, but the testimonies from former employees and passengers will solidify their liability. Aaliyah nodded, her resolve evident. We need to make it clear that this isn't just about one flight attendant. It's about an entire system that allowed her behavior to thrive. Charles stopped pacing and looked at her, his expression serious. Are you ready for the cross-examination? They're going to come after you hard, try to paint you as overly combative, or out for money. I'm ready, Aaliyah said firmly. They can try, but the truth is on my side. Before Charles could respond, his assistant entered the room with a stack of papers. The airline's legal team just submitted their pre-trial motions, she said. They're requesting a dismissal, arguing that the incident was an isolated misunderstanding. Charles scoffed as he flipped through the pages. Desperate move. They know this won't hold up with the evidence we have. They're still trying to sweep this under the rug, Aaliyah said, leaning forward. Exactly, Charles replied, but we won't let them. This is just the first of many attempts to undermine the case. Stay focused. Back at the airline's headquarters, the tension was palpable. Rachel Bennett sat in yet another conference room, flanked by top executives and legal counsel. The stakes had never been higher, and the mounting public pressure was relentless. This is unsustainable, one executive said, his voice tight with frustration. We're hemorrhaging public trust. If this goes to trial, we're finished. Rachel's gaze was steely. Then we need to settle before it gets to that point. And if she refuses? Another executive asked. Rachel's silence spoke volumes. She knew the truth. Aaliyah Johnson wasn't backing down, and the airline's attempts to control the narrative were quickly slipping out of their grasp. Charles nodded slowly, then turned to the courtroom, his voice steady and deliberate. So, to summarize, Captain, you relied solely on Miss Parker's account without verifying the details yourself. You only filed a report after the incident went viral, correct? The captain's expression tightened. Yes, that's correct. Charles took a measured step forward, his tone sharpening. Would you say that reflects a commitment to fairness and accountability? Or was it an attempt to protect the airline from scrutiny? The captain shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. I was following procedure, he replied, his voice less certain now. Procedure, Charles repeated, the word heavy with implication. And would you agree that those procedures allowed a discriminatory incident to unfold unchecked, leaving the affected passenger, my client, humiliated and displaced? The captain hesitated, his silence louder than any response. Charles let the moment hang, then turned toward the judge. No further questions, Your Honor. As the trial progressed, the airline's defense continued to unravel. Witness after witness reinforced the narrative of systemic neglect and complicity. A former HR manager testified about the mishandling of complaints, admitting that the company prioritized avoiding bad press over addressing legitimate grievances. The culture discouraged escalation, she stated plainly. We were told to handle things quietly to protect the brand. The plaintiff's gallery nodded in quiet agreement, their expressions a mix of vindication and determination. Aaliyah glanced back at the rows of supporters, her confidence bolstered by their presence. By the afternoon, it was time for closing arguments. The courtroom was electric with anticipation as Charles stood, his presence commanding. He began with a calm but impassioned tone. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today you've heard a story that is, unfortunately, not unique. It's a story of a system that prioritizes image over integrity and silence over accountability. My client, Aaliyah Johnson, paid for her seat. She followed all the rules, yet she was targeted, humiliated, and removed from that seat, not because of any mistake on her part, but because of a culture that allowed discrimination to flourish." Charles paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. This case is not just about Natalie Parker. It's about an airline that ignored repeated warnings, dismissed complaints, and failed to act until it was forced to. The video evidence, the testimonies, and the company's own inaction paint a clear picture of a systemic failure. A failure that hurt not only Miss House Johnson but countless others who were too afraid or unable to speak up. He turned to the jury, his voice firm. "This is your opportunity to send a message, to say that discrimination in any form is unacceptable, to demand accountability from corporations that believe they are above reproach. Justice for Ms. Johnson is justice for everyone who has been made to feel invisible, less than, or unwelcome because of the color of their skin." Charles returned to his seat, the room buzzing with a collective energy. The airline's lead attorney rose next, their tone defensive yet calculated. They argued that the company had acted swiftly to terminate Natalie Parker and emphasized the internal investigation launched in response to the incident. "This was an isolated event," the attorney insisted. "The actions of one employee do not represent the values of the entire airline." But the argument rang hollow, met with skeptical expressions from the jury and muffled whispers from the gallery. When the judge finally adjourned the court for deliberation, Aaliyah felt a mix of exhaustion and hope. She stood beside Charles as they packed up their notes, the weight of the trial finally catching up to her. "You did great," Charles said, his tone reassuring. "Thank you," Aaliyah replied softly. "I just hope it was enough." Charles gave her a small smile. "The truth is powerful, Aaliyah." And today, the truth was undeniable. The jury deliberated for hours, the anticipation in the courthouse building with each passing moment. Reporters crowded the steps outside, their cameras capturing the tension etched on every face. Supporters gathered in the gallery, their quiet conversations filled with hope and determination. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom fell silent. Aaliyah's heart pounded as the foreperson rose to deliver the verdict. "We find in favor of the plaintiff, Ms. Aaliyah Johnson," they announced, "and award damages in the amount of—" The rest of the sentence was drowned out by a collective gasp and quiet cheers from the gallery. Aaliyah's hands trembled as she clasped them together, tears welling in her eyes. Charles placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his smile one of quiet triumph. Outside the courthouse, Aaliyah stepped into a sea of reporters and supporters. Cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust toward her as questions flew. She raised a hand, silencing the crowd. "This verdict is a step toward justice," she said, her voice strong and clear. "But the fight doesn't end here. We must continue to hold corporations accountable, to dismantle systems of prejudice, and to ensure that no one else has to endure what I did. Together, we can create change." The crowd erupted in applause, and Aaliyah felt the weight of the moment settle over her. She had won not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced or ignored. This was only the beginning. As the courtroom quieted, Natalie Parker walked to the witness stand, her posture rigid, her expression a mask of defiance. The room seemed to collectively hold its breath as the bailiff swore her in. Charles stood from his seat, his measured confidence radiating through the room. He approached the stand with the precision of a seasoned litigator. "Miss Parker," Charles began, his voice steady but sharp, "you've stated that your actions on Flight 347 were motivated by protocol. Can you explain why, specifically, you targeted Ms. Johnson?" Natalie's lips pressed into a thin line. "I wasn't targeting her," she replied, her tone defensive. "There was a discrepancy with her ticket. As we've already established, her ticket was valid. Charles interjected smoothly. Yet you insisted on removing her from first class. Why? I was doing my job, Natalie said, her voice rising slightly. Your job, Charles echoed, lifting a folder from the table and pulling out several documents. Let's examine what your job entailed. Over the years, multiple complaints have been filed against you. Complaints from both passengers and colleagues alleging discriminatory behavior. Were you aware of these? Natalie's eyes darted nervously, her confidence faltering. Those were misunderstandings, she muttered. Misunderstandings, Charles said, stepping closer to the witness box, his voice cutting through the tension. Or a pattern of behavior that your employer chose to ignore? Natalie opened her mouth to respond, but Charles cut her off, holding up a transcript. In the video evidence, you can be heard saying, "People like her always make everything about race." Care to explain that statement? Natalie's face flushed a deep red, her composure crumbling. I misspoke, she stammered. Misspoke, Charles repeated, letting the word hang in the air. Or did you reveal your true intentions? The courtroom was silent as Natalie struggled for a response. Charles turned to the jury, his voice steady and deliberate. This isn't an isolated incident. This is the result of a systemic failure, a culture that allowed this behavior to thrive unchecked. The final blow came when Charles called Lauren Davis back to the stand for rebuttal. Her testimony was brief, but devastating. I reported Ms. Parker's behavior multiple times, Lauren said, her voice firm. Each time, management brushed it off. They cared more about avoiding bad PR than protecting passengers. As the trial neared its conclusion, the courtroom was packed with spectators, the air thick with anticipation. Charles's closing argument was nothing short of masterful. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, his voice steady and resolute. Ms. Johnson was not just a passenger on that flight. She was a victim of a system that failed her at every level. This case is not about one bad actor. It's about a corporation that allowed prejudice to thrive unchecked. Justice demands action, not silence. The airline's attorney attempted to redirect blame solely onto Natalie, framing her as a lone bad actor. But the evidence and testimonies presented had created cracks too large to cover. The jury deliberated for hours, the courthouse brimming with tension. When they finally returned, the foreperson stood, their voice clear and unwavering. In the matter of Johnson versus Meridian Airlines, we find in favor of the plaintiff, Ms. Aaliyah Johnson. A wave of relief and vindication swept over Aaliyah as the judge announced the damages. A substantial monetary award and a directive for the airline to implement mandatory diversity and anti-discrimination training across all departments. The courtroom erupted into murmurs as Aaliyah turned to Charles, her face breaking into a triumphant smile. "We did it," she whispered. "You did it," Charles replied. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Aaliyah, their cameras flashing. She stepped into the spotlight with calm determination, her voice carrying over the crowd. "This verdict is more than a personal victory," she said, her tone strong but measured. "It's a call to action. Companies like Meridian Airlines need to do more than issue apologies. They need to dismantle the systems that allow discrimination to persist. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who has ever been targeted, silenced, or ignored." Her words sparked murmurs and applause among supporters gathered nearby. Michael Rivera stood to the side, recording every moment. He gave her a subtle nod of encouragement as his camera captured her unwavering resolve. Later that evening, Aaliyah sat in her apartment, surrounded by flowers, cards, and emails of support. The outpouring of solidarity was overwhelming, but also a reminder of the weight she now carried. She scrolled through social media, where her name trended alongside hashtags like Chanan Justice for Aaliyah and End Airline Discrimination. The momentum was undeniable. Her phone buzzed with a call from Charles. "Have you seen the news?" he asked. "Hard to miss," she replied, glancing at her TV, where a panel of experts discussed the broader implications of her case. "They're calling this a landmark moment," Charles said. "The damages awarded and the mandated reforms, it's going to set a precedent." "Good," Aaliyah said, leaning back and letting out a deep breath. But I'm not stopping here. Charles chuckled lightly. I had a feeling you'd say that. What's next? I want to make sure the airline follows through on their promises, she said. And I want to use this momentum to push for industry-wide reform. If this can happen at Meridian, it's happening elsewhere too. You've got the platform to make a real impact, Charles said. And I intend to use it, Aaliyah replied. This isn't just my fight anymore. It's ours. Charles nodded with a supportive smile as he leaned back in his chair. Do it, he said firmly. And if you ever need legal support, you know where to find me. Thank you, Charles, Aaliyah replied sincerely, her voice tinged with gratitude. I couldn't have done this without you. Across the city, Natalie Parker sat alone in her dimly lit apartment, the flickering glow of the TV casting shadows on her pale face. The news was relentless, replaying clips of Aaliyah addressing crowds outside the courthouse, her words now a rallying cry for change. Natalie's once confident demeanor had crumbled into bitterness and regret. Her phone lay silent on the table, ignored by family and avoided by friends. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid her, and her name had become synonymous with bigotry. As she watched the images of Aaliyah on the screen, her lips tightened, and for the first time, she felt the crushing weight of her actions. It wasn't just the public humiliation that stung. It was the realization of the harm she had inflicted on a woman she had tried to diminish. A week later, Aaliyah stood in front of a packed auditorium at a major civil rights conference. The room buzzed with energy as attendees leaned in, eager to hear her speak. Aaliyah stepped forward, her presence commanding as she recounted her journey, not as a victim, but as a catalyst for change. What happened to me wasn't unique, she began, her voice resolute and steady, echoing through the hall. It's part of a larger pattern, a system that needs to be dismantled. Discrimination can't be allowed to hide behind policies or be ignored by corporations that prioritize profits over people. Together, we can hold them accountable. The room erupted in applause, a wave of support washing over her. Aaliyah felt a surge of pride and purpose. She had transformed her pain into a powerful platform, amplifying the voices of those who had been silenced for far too long. Meanwhile, Meridian Airlines scrambled to repair its tarnished reputation. The company announced sweeping reforms, including mandatory diversity and sensitivity training across all departments. They also established an independent oversight committee to handle complaints and prevent further instances of discrimination. In a rare public statement, the airline's CEO acknowledged their failures. We fell short, not just in addressing Ms. C.C. Johnson's experience, but in fostering an inclusive environment for all of our passengers. We are committed to rebuilding trust through meaningful action. The reforms signaled a shift, but the true victory was broader. Passengers who had faced similar injustices began sharing their own stories, creating a ripple effect that sparked a wave of activism. The momentum extended far beyond the airline industry, igniting conversations and movements in workplaces, schools, and communities across the nation. Months later, Aaliyah found herself boarding another flight. This time, it wasn't for a vacation or work. It was to testify before Congress in Washington, D.C., advocating for federal regulations to combat discrimination in the airline industry. As she settled into her seat in first class, the flight attendant approached her with a warm, genuine smile. "Ms. Johnson," she said softly, "I just wanted to say thank you. What you did, it's making a real difference." Aaliyah returned the smile, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and hope. "Thank you," she replied, "but there's still more work to do." As the plane lifted off, Aaliyah gazed out the window, the sprawling clouds below mirroring the boundless opportunities ahead. Her mind raced with ideas for what was next. Initiatives to support passengers, campaigns to push for systemic change, and programs to empower others to stand up against injustice. The journey had been long and grueling, marked by both triumphs and sacrifices. But Aaliyah knew one thing for certain: justice wasn't a destination, it was a path, and she was determined to keep walking it, not just for herself, but for everyone who deserved better.